Hello, everyone. How to deal with enemies is the topic. Why is that so funny? First, I hope nobody has any enemies. But just in case, whether they're real or perceived, we're going to address this topic. And hopefully in the broadest sense, both on a personal level, on a communal level, on a global level. Unfortunately, we do live in a world where there are people who are sworn enemies. You know, think of what's going on in the Middle East, where people literally consider it a mitzvah, quote unquote, to kill others in the name of God, the name of no God, whatever the reason is. So on the global level, clearly there is that element. It's true that the world is a far more peaceful place today than it ever has been. But still, we do have, I don't know the numbers, but you have people who are, as I said, sworn enemies, who consider others as infidels. Just look at the latest disruptions and uprisings and strife in Israel, the Temple Mount. We're literally coming a few days from the saddest day in the Jewish calendar, Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, which was all about the Temple Mount. And the battles continued to be fought over the Temple Mount. And I've talked about this topic many times. So you see, the word enemies unfortunately exists. And they're not imagined. On a more microcosmic level, we each, hopefully people can say they have no enemies. But I think many people feel that they do have enemies in their lives. As I said, it may be real, it may be imagined, and we're going to discuss how you determine that. Perceived or real, people who we see as being our adversaries of ours, and often we feel hurt by them, abused by them, and we see them as people who are our enemies. So the question really is it something that's in our minds? Is it real? Can we distinguish between a real enemy? Is someone that disagrees with you always an enemy? If someone that competes with you always an enemy? Is it across the board? How do you distinguish? And how especially if you're not objective? And then, of course, we have different attitudes. Let's say you could establish whether it's a real or perceived enemy. Do you behave more? Do you confront? Do you retreat? Are you passive? Are you aggressive? Do you know when to be aggressive and when to be passive? When to confront and when to retreat? Are you ready to reconcile? Are you open to reconciliation? Or are you a person who, when someone crosses you, you bear a grudge, sometimes a lifetime grudge, and you can't get over it? And sometimes we're consumed with feelings of ill feelings, of anger, hate, even vengeance, and we can't get beyond it. These are all part of the questions in addressing these enemies. And then, of course, there's the question, who is the real enemy? Is it really the enemy outside of you, or maybe you're your own worst enemy? In the sense where we have our own insecurities, the enemy within, our fears, and often that we project. So we become extremely sensitive, and therefore we can project and determine that other people are out to get us, when in truth it may be our inner issues, our own psychological enemy. So all this is part of the discussion. Pretty broad. And I find it, as I've mentioned, these questions and this type of topic is really generated from you. When I say you, I mean people who are listening, people who are studying, who participate in our classes and programs. And that's what we've been doing, reaching out lately to hear what people are interested in. And I find the topic particularly important because it's not spoken about enough. It's an under-discussed topic. It's true we talk about enemies and we talk about being benevolent, being compassionate, but it's really more in a phrase discussed superficially. It's not an easy topic to discuss, but most people are not ready to actually go and say, 1 second, maybe I'm just deceiving myself into thinking that I have these enemies. Maybe I don't. And then, of course, comes the question, do you cherish your friends as much as you loathe your enemies? Are we consumed more with the negative as opposed to the positive? And of course, the biggest question of all is, can we transcend it all? Can we rise to take the high road and maybe even preempt and prevent and not have enemies in the first place? Is that possible? So all this is going to be covered, hopefully, to some extent in this discussion. And as I said, I think it's both personally relevant, communally relevant, because the fact is we do live in a world of conflict, and conflicts that are either between interpersonal, communities, in cities, in nations, globally, and of course our own inner conflicts. So wherever there's conflict by definition means that there's there's adversity. And adversity means that there's so-called two sides. And I'll, as I said, try to address it from many different angles. Obviously it's based on 3,000-4,000 years of timeless wisdom, which some people call the Torah, including the mystical and the spiritual and psychological application of it all. And there are fascinating insights into this. And the truth is that this is one of the topics that you really, in a very blatant and glaring way, can see the difference between symptoms and between roots. Because most of our attitudes to that word called enemy, however we define it, is mostly about symptoms. You know, we feel we've been hurt. We feel we have grievances to different people who we feel have in some way hurt us, wounded us, and the emotions, the base emotions that elicits, are usually our reaction. Someone insults you. Someone does something that offends you. Someone in any way violates you in one way or another, violates your dignity, your respect. You react usually viscerally and very knee-jerk reaction. And as we know, enemies can bring the worst out of us, sometimes the best out of us, because they touch a raw nerve of protecting yourself. So it becomes increasingly difficult to really step back and look at it objectively, because once you're already hurt, and once you perceive something as being your enemy, it's not that easy to just say, okay, 1 second, let me look at it. But I do believe, because we're intelligent creatures, that if we are encouraged and we're educated and we're trained how to step back and look at ourselves, we could somewhat untangle the interactions that we have with the world around us by looking at it a little more with clear and more sober eyes. We're always subjective, but there are many methods, and I discuss them very often in these classes, how we can move from some subjectivity to total subjectivity and total blind spots to some type of clarity. And of course, one of the key ways is to have good friends, to have mentors, to have even one friend, one mentor that can help be like a sounding board, that you can review and look at things in a more objective light. And once you see things a little clearer, your reactions also will be affected. So this issue called enemies is one of those specific issues. And I'll speak about it even on a very, let's put it from a Jewish perspective. Jews have been at the brunt of many enemies. Probably in history, there's been no nation that has suffered more from people who perceive Jews as their enemy, whether it was the Nazis, whether it was the Cossacks, whether it was the Inquisitors, whether it was the Crusades, whether it was the Christians in general for so long, whether it's the Muslims, many of them today, saw the Jews as enemy. Why the Jews are the lightning rod, or some call the miner's canary, is another discussion which I'm not going to go into now because that's not the topic. But we've seen it, and when you have a reaction, many Jews have that defensive reaction. They hear something, and right away it feeds right into, oh, is this an anti-Semite? Is this another uprising of Nazism or some form of neo-Nazism in our times? And many of us have those visceral and very knee-jerk emotional reactions because we've suffered greatly, especially people who grew up in families that have suffered. So it's completely understandable. But does it sometimes go overboard? You know, it's always obviously better to be safe than sorry, but you can't start looking at everyone as your enemy. The fact is there are nations, and there are Chasidei Umm, the righteous Gentiles, they're righteous people. Look at the United States in general, as a country has been a tremendous haven and almost a divine gift to the Jewish people in their ability to worship freely, to do as they see fit, to educate their children as they see fit, etc. I'm not suggesting there aren't individuals, and many individuals, but institutionally, we live in far better times than ever before. So with all that said, it's important to remember, and both on a collective, let's speak on a personal level. If you've convinced yourself, and maybe for good reason, that there's somebody out to get you at work, in your family, extended family, strangers, and let's say you can even establish that it's true, it becomes very difficult to diffuse it because you're already going to be reacting defensively because you have evidence and you've seen yourself being hurt. But as I mentioned before, sometimes we project, sometimes it's over-exaggerated, sometimes it's our own inner feeling of inadequacy, that feeling defenseless, that causes us to look for, in a sense, like I don't say scapegoats, but to give more power than should be given to people who may call themselves our enemies. So all this makes it more complicated. But as I said many times, Yediyah Samach L'Chetzer Refuah, half the cure of any problem is awareness. Awareness is half the cure. Looking at something, dissecting it, that's the key thing. We need to dissect it and explore it from within. So, I should, as I always do, begin by saying that on a mystical level, fundamentally, the whole concept that people can be enemies of each other is actually quite an anomaly, quite bizarre. Because since divine unity, and unity is the integral factor that connects everything in existence, it would be like saying, are there really enemies in nature? Or really is nature just one symbiotic whole? Even predator and prey, even though we do not like to see a predator kill prey, but if you think of the balance of nature, it's actually necessary to keep the balance. Because if the prey were not killed, they would overpopulate and they could destroy the universe. So there is a certain symmetry to the balance of nature. Even when things seem to be somewhat destructive in nature, I'm not talking about human beings who have free will. In nature, there is a balance. And for example, if human beings were not in the line of fire, were not in the path of a hurricane or a tornado, or a tsunami, or a earthquake, or a volcano, those are all parts of nature's market corrections and reality checks that are necessary to keep the balance going. You know, earthquakes happen every few seconds under the water, and we don't even know about it. And they're necessary for the balance, because if they didn't happen, the plates, what do they call them? The plates. I forgot what the word is. The tectonic plates. Would the tension that would scrape within each other could create tremendous damage. So earthquakes, in a way, relieve the tension, as do volcanoes, as do winds, as do rains, as do storms. The problem begins when humans are in the path and they could be hurt by it. So essentially, there's a balance in nature, and you can't say things are enemies of each other, even though I know the language would be that the lamb is an enemy of the wolf. The wolf is an enemy of the lamb, I should say. That's because that's a predator and prey. But I don't know if we should really use the word enemy. It would be really one is going to be the prey of the other. But in general, that language would not really be used. So it's only humans that really create the concept of enemies, because we can create an element of abusing each other. And as I've always mentioned, the Talmud says, the Yerushalmi says, that all people are limbs of one organism. Just like all atoms are part of one big existence, all human beings are part of one organism. So how is it possible for the right hand to hit the left hand? The only reason is because it's concealed. We don't see the unity. So the mere fact that there's war, and there's injustice, and there's abuse, is really an aberration from the true natural order. But it is an aberration, and it does exist. So I just wanted to begin by saying that, because in other words, fundamentally, and that's why when we believe in the Messianic age, what is its key feature? Peace. That there will be peace on earth. That nations will live side by side, even though there will be diversity, but there'll be harmony with the diversity. That they will not lift a sword against each other. The swords will be turned into plowshares. All the prophecies all talk about the peace. And actually, the wolf will lay with the lamb, it says. And the leopard with the child. And the different other verses that all testify to a world of peace, which is considered to be not a miracle, but the natural order. So I just wanted to use that, just begin with a certain disclaimer, just to begin. But the fact of the matter is, we do deal with enemies. The reason I mentioned this introduction is because if that is indeed the case, then the truth is we should be seeking ultimately for a state where there is no need to have enemies. Now, of course, the immediate rejoinder would be, 1 second, I have no problem. I won't be anyone's enemy. The problem is other people feel they're threatened by me. And they declare war against me, which is, of course, the case in many instances where we speak and we talk about, always blaming the other. Now, it's true, there are instances where we would be ready completely be at peace, and it's someone else that is the aggressor. Fine. But very often in battles, especially between individuals, especially spouses or in family structures, it usually takes two to tango. I'm not saying there aren't exceptions. And in general, even with real enemies, sworn enemies, you can always complicate matters when you respond tit for tat. So with that being said, that essentially we do believe and we do fundamentally hold on to that spirit, that the truth is the world is really a unified place and people could really live in peace, even if they're different. In other words, we don't have to be the same to be at peace. We could respect each other's different opinions. That helps tremendously in our attitude to how we deal with enemies. Because some people will say, no, the world is a hostile place, dog eats dog, everyone's your enemy, everyone's guilty until proven innocent. There are people that think that way. You could even say it's an outgrowth of a Freudian way of thinking, where the id, the wild, untamed id, of the pleasure principle, me, is the driving force. So of course, if everybody has an id that's a wild, untamed id, what do you think you'll have? You'll have chaos, you'll have anarchy. However, there's an ego and a superego and other forces that superimpose themselves to keep order. But fundamentally, push people to the brink, and they will kill each other if they have to fight over the same resource. And we see this in many instances, horrible instances, what people resort to when it comes to their own survival, especially if nobody's watching. So that attitude basically is that the world is a hostile world and everyone's your enemy unless there's something in it for them. And especially if you go with the radical evolutionary biological viewpoint, the selfish gene in Richard Dawkins' classic book, then every gene is selfish. Every gene is the enemy of another gene because everyone wants to survive. And whether it's animal species or humans, we are all competing over resources, survival of the fittest. Isn't that, by definition, means that everybody's your enemy? Except when it's good for your survival. So then you make a deal. I get something. You serve a purpose that helps my survival, so therefore I'll coexist with you. But if you think about it, that's completely also driven by survival. And should that change, then you become mortal enemies. This is, in the radical form of it, is truly a perspective that many people have. People don't like to speak about it because we also like to think about ourselves as noble, as sensitive, as compassionate, as giving, as loving. However, if you read the books, especially the more cynical and the more brutal, brute, raw scientific view, some say there's absolutely nothing compassionate about this world. And compassion itself is part of survival. So we're compassionate because it helps preserve my species, preserve my genes, perpetuate them to the next generation. The Torah completely disagrees with that axiom. And its view is the exact opposite. That fundamentally the universe is a united universe. And fundamentally we are all brothers and sisters. And we all complement each other like one grand musical symphony. But there was an aberration. There was a paradigm shift. Whether it's the tree, eating from the tree of knowledge in the biblical tree of knowledge, or in the mystical terms, it's the diminishment of the moon, or it's the shattering of the vessels of the world of Tayu, the spiritual containers, or the different so-called dissonances that were created throughout history, going back to the classical the Arizal's doctrine of the Tzimtzum, the concealment of the divine, turning the universe inside out, where we think the outside is more important than the inside, where we worship the glove more than the hand inside the glove, where we value the peel more than the fruit, which of course is a distortion, but that's how it is. We worship and we value and we're more influenced through our sensory tools, what we see, hear, taste, touch, and smell, than what is the deeper truth of things. And people will compromise the deeper truths and of their values for externals, for instant gratification, for the moment, which tells you how distorted our viewpoint is. But all that is an anomaly. That is an aberration. That is not the natural order. So it's a very different perspective. In that type of perspective, then basically everybody's innocent until proven guilty. This still doesn't mean we don't lock our doors and we just are naive into thinking everybody's going to just do anything for us, because the fact of the matter, people also have another side to them, an ugly side, the left side called the evil inclination, the selfish side. So I'm not denying that there isn't a selfish component in people, but the question is, what is the core of who you are? The id or the yid, as I pointed out many times. The pintel yid, the spark, which goes deeper than the id. And that principle also sets us up to be able to look at adversary. I'm sorry, at adversaries. Adversity and adversary. At adversaries in a different way. Because then what we're doing is looking at them and saying, okay, at this point they're an enemy, but that's not the end story. The end story is that we could ultimately be friends. And even in your own self, if you think yourself as being your own worst enemy, that's also not true. At the heart of it all is really a unifying element, and that's what we need to look for. But we also have to deal with the facts on the ground, that we may be dealing with a true enemy and we have to protect ourselves. That doesn't mean that the end of the story, even though there is that aberration and we have to deal with it, that doesn't mean, the fact that fundamentally we believe in an ultimate unity and that we all can live in harmony, that doesn't mean we can be naive in thinking that we can't have on the ground true enemies. So with that stated, and I'll get back to it a little later, of how we reach that transcendent place, we have to first deal with the realities on the ground. So let's start with the most important question of all. How do you determine whether something is really your enemy or not? You may think that that person is your enemy for whatever reason, and you may turn out to be that's not even true. Could be due to our own, as I said before, insecurities or not. So the first thing we have to establish is objectivity. What's the objective truth? So on a very practical level, if you do indeed think somebody at work or somebody in family or in another situation is indeed out to get you, so to speak, in some way feels you threatened by you, and you see that they in some way can undermine you, speak behind your back, or do other things that would be considered like a declaration of war, the first and most important thing is to establish whether it's true. And the way to do that is not always, you can't always ask that person, because that's not going to really always work. One of the ways is by actually talking to a friend. I've often people come and consult with me, and I've consulted with others, to be honest, when I felt somebody was doing something that seemed confrontational or challenging, to determine maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's my head. Maybe I'm overly sensitive. Maybe I feel guilty over something. And it's critical to run it by, because you don't want to be consumed, as I said before, and live a life in fear or concerned about something that perhaps can be looked at in a very different way. So there are two options that can happen here. You determine, you know what? Maybe it's a little overblown. Maybe that person thought I said something wrong, and they feel that you are their enemy, so therefore they're reciprocating. That's often the case. A misunderstanding, a different type of language or culture, where you start off on the wrong foot. And these things are critical to nip in the bud, because when they start growing into monsters, it becomes much more difficult to deal with, because then they become part of our reality, so to speak. So the first step is you have to establish that. And you begin wherever you are. If you are right now in a situation where you feel threatened, or you feel someone resents you, or you feel anything of that type of enemy energy, so to speak, you have to figure out whether there's any truth to it. Now, you may figure out there's some truth, but not as much as you thought. Or you may figure out that there is truth to it. We'll get to that. Let's first eliminate. If you find that there isn't much truth to it, and there's something that can be done to diffuse it, by all means, it's in your own interest. And it's also will give you the self-confidence. If you go and do something about it, like you'd always send a third party and say, you know something, I know there's bad blood between us. I know that there's things, maybe things have been said, maybe I did something this, in a way, a very conciliatory way, not necessarily weakness, and the person may respond very well and say, you're right, I feel the same way, and I'm glad you brought it up. And maybe there needs to be mutual apologies and whatever it is, diplomacy. And this is not an act of strength. I'm not suggesting an act of weakness. Some people will say, well, if I do that, I'll look weak. Well, if you've established that the person is not really an enemy, then maybe that's not an element of weakness. It's coming from strength because you really do want to clear the air. Now, there's another two scenarios. Let's say the other person doesn't reciprocate. They say, you know what, I don't know what you're talking about, or I can't forgive you, you're a bad person, or blah, 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 or they deny it. Okay, so then at least you've tried. So you have at least that under your belt. And the next step would perhaps be is to figure out how to untangle yourself. Who says you have to interact? If the person by all means refuses to so-called have a conversation or do something with it, so maybe the approach has to be cordial. You can agree to disagree or whatever it is. And yes, rise to a higher level, take the high road, and not engage. This person doesn't seem to want to be a friend of yours. Choose your battles. Who says you have to fix everything? That would be the attitude of a healthy person. Because what you're doing here is you're becoming proactive. As I mentioned before, one of the big problems in dealing with the sentiment of feeling hated or feeling that somebody is an enemy of yours is the demoralization, but more importantly, reactive responses. You react. You react either with reciprocal anger or reciprocal hatred or vengeance or retreating and being resentful because you have to be quiet. Whether it's passive-aggressive, doesn't matter whether we're passive-aggressive, aggressive or passive-aggressive, because bottom line is that person is forcing you to react. And that always undermines a person's self-esteem. Because reaction means someone else is in control and you're reacting to them. Whereas the approach I'm suggesting is one that you become proactive. You're taking the bull by the horns, you're going to figure this out. And you establish, as I said, maybe it's overblown, maybe it can be resolved, and maybe it can't. And if it can't, it's not your problem, it's that person's problem. You want to hate me? That's your problem. I'm out of this. And you become free from the toxins that someone who, whatever, is petty or foolish or jealous, that could also be. There are people who are jealous. I mean, I deal with, unfortunately, sometimes even family members, where one sibling is very jealous of another, and they turn them into the enemy because they feel that brother or sister was treated better, or is special, was given a special treatment, and et cetera, et cetera. Favoritism. And it could be, could not be, but those are sometimes very hard to diffuse because people don't admit it. They say, I'm not jealous. Who wants to admit they're jealous? They say, she's a witch. She did this, she did that. Or the sister, or it's a brother. So the key here is to take in control. You control your emotions. And you control it by first figuring out. The first thing is always assessment. You need to assess the situation. Diagnose the situation. Is it true that this person is my enemy? And if yes, if no, do things to diffuse it. And if yes, and it's something that you're not in your control because that person refuses to cooperate or refuses to engage, then you have to simply, even if it's a family member, you be cordial, you have to always be pleasant, and you just say, you know what, I can't go deeper with this person, I can't go further, this is not a person I can really have a real relationship with, and that's it. Now, I'm not going to get into now spouses and people that you must have a relationship with and what to do that, because I can't cover everything in one discussion. If spouses consider themselves enemies, that's a whole discussion of its own, why that's the case. And that, too, can also be resolved in some of the suggestions I'm going to be making here. Okay, so I've established at least that you become proactive, you're in control, and at least you can then not become part of the problem and be contaminated or in some ways affected by the other person's toxins. But let's now establish, let's go a step further. Let's establish the person is truly an enemy. And in the sense, I say the word enemy is also a very broad term. I don't know, sometimes we have to just say adversary, meaning not say an enemy, a sworn enemy, but someone that is hostile to you. That's something that is negative to you, that resents you in some way. So if you establish that, As I said, and you could get out of the line of fire. So that's the first step. The best thing to do is you don't need to engage with that person. Now, what happens if you have no choice but you have to engage? It's a superior, a boss at work. Or it's a situation of family where you really have no choice and you need to engage. Or another scenario, you may not need to engage, but that person is continuously shooting at you. And I don't just mean physically. Someone is trying to hurt you. What do you do in that type of situation? And this, I have to broaden the question, of course, on a global scale, when you have people who actually are ready to kill. They're ready to kill innocent children, and they have proven that they're ready to kill. Look at the Muslim terrorists that have done so across Israel for sure, now in Europe and other places in the world. What do you do about that? So, obviously, we can't be naive. You can't just say, you know what, I'll untangle myself. That's the psychological side of it. That you have to realize, as I often discuss in the verse, in the chapter Kiseitse, which we'll be reading later, basically the end of the next month, Kiseitse, we're now in the, around a month from now, Kiseitse, where it says, Kiseitse le'melchama, when you will go out to war, alevecha, upon your enemies. And we've discussed a number of times that Kiseitse le'melchama, why go out to war? Go out, just say, Kisilcham, when you will wage war, to go out to war upon your enemies. Why is it upon? With your enemies. Because the key is to always remember that every war fought, whether it's a physical war, a spiritual war, a psychological, emotional, you are always in a position of strength if you realize the war is not in here. The war is out there. As I said, you rise to the occasion, you're in a higher place. You are not going to let somebody else's war affect you. The Jews suffered greatly in history, but they did not become sufferers. Just because the Nazis killed us, we didn't just go ahead and reciprocate. Our revengeance was we're going to build families and we'll have children and grandchildren. So a war is always not, you are not going to turn me into a warrior, because there's no war in my home, in my heart, in my soul. I will do what I have to do to protect, but it's going to be outside of me. And number two, your enemy is not equal to you. Sun Tzu, in his book, The Art of War, Sun Tzu writes that wars are won before you even begin fighting. And then you finish it by the actual battle. In other words, wars are won in your head when you have that confidence, that absolute supreme confidence, knowing that you have already won the war because you've preempted it, because you're 5 steps ahead of your enemy. So you're above your enemy. The worst is when you let the war enter in here, and you're not going out to war, and you think you're equal. So that's what I was saying earlier, that we fundamentally believe and are connected to something higher, that many times the expression, you're tied above, you don't fall below. I still am not addressing how you deal with the enemy, but the first thing is you must psychologically cannot drop yourself, lower yourself, be dragged down to that level. The story of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, I always mention the story where they pointed the gun to his head. They said, this has changed many people's mind to cooperate. And he said, this toy can only frighten someone that has one world and many gods, but not someone that has one God and many worlds. So you never become equal to your adversaries, your enemies. However, that's in your mind, and that's your attitude. And that's why there were actually armies, military, that before they went out to war, they would sing a song of victory, even before the first shot was fired, before the first battle. Because it was a demonstration of absolute confidence, we will win this battle. We will win this war. But that addresses our own state of mind, psychological warfare. If you're not confident in that, you can have all the weapons in the world. You can outnumber your enemy and still lose. Look at Vietnam. It's a tremendous study. Vietnam, a bamboo economy. What could you even compare it to the United States? And still, the United States did not win that war. With all its military, with all its firepower, with all its numbers. Because the United States Army, no one even knew why they were fighting the war. It began officially as the domino effect of communism spreading in the Far East. But then at some point, even the military themselves and the leaders lost belief. Why are we fighting here? You ask the average person in the Vietnam War, American military, why are we here? They say, I don't really know. We're just taking orders. It became so insane. Whereas the Vietnamese were fighting for their lives. This is our little land here. This is where we live. It's a very biggest lesson in life. Wars are not just about power. Wars is about your mind. What are you fighting for? If you have no reason to fight. And more important, you can't even know how to measure victory. You think you can win a war if you don't even know what victory consists of or why you're fighting? So there's a whole psychological element, as I said, that begins even before you begin the battle. That's the first most important thing. Then comes the next step. So what do you actually do with the enemy? The bottom line is, fine, your attitudes are beautiful, but you have someone shooting at you. In Israel, no matter what their attitude is, the Israeli military is very powerful, and the Jewish confidence is there and all that. We've seen it in the different wars, miraculously in the Six-Day War and so on. But you still have people shooting at you. So because you have the presence of mind and you're not overwhelmed emotionally and psychologically by the enemy, you can think about it. And this, again, is a deliberate, sober strategy. So we learn from Jacob what you do. Jacob had a sworn enemy. His name was Esau. It was actually his twin brother. And for even legitimate reasons or not legitimate reasons, Esau wanted to kill him. Stealing the birthright and stealing the blessings. And the Torah describes it in detail. And even after 20 years of escaping, Jacob comes back 20 years later to his parents' home. On his way home, he is concerned what's going to be with his twin brother. Where does he stand after 20 years? And he's told in the chapter of Vayishlach that his brother is marching with 400 men to war. Clearly an enemy, and he's declaring war. So he realized there's problems. What did he do? Here is a man of God. This is how he prepares and deals with an enemy. And a tremendous lesson for each one of us, personally, collectively, globally. He prepares 3 different ways. He does not just prepare for war. He obviously prepares for war because he needs to be well prepared, not be naive, and he needs to defend himself and his family from Esau and his army. But he does 2 other things as well. He prays to God to help protect him. So in other words, he invokes his religious and spiritual strength to make sure that he has that so-called support. And number 2, he wisely and prudently prepares a bribe to appease Esau. He prepares gifts for him. And he makes a whole plan that when they encounter Esau, he's going to present these gifts, which may soften his heart. He's basically looking and covering all his bases. So his hope was that the prayer and the appeasement and the bribe would be enough. He wouldn't need war. But the last resort, you need to fight. I'm ready to fight. So thank God that's what happened. The first 2 did work. The appeasement worked, and Esau responded. There are 2 opinions whether he responded completely sincerely or not completely sincerely. But bottom line, there was no war. Why? Because Yaakov didn't panic. He realized, yes, I have an enemy, my brother, and I'll do what I have to do to protect myself. But war is not my first option. It's my last option. If there's no choice, I'm ready. He didn't just say, I'll rely on my faith and on the appeasement. He covered all his bases. And that was enough, and it worked. Now, had it been war, he would have gone to war. No choice, he would have gone. And he had a plan for that too. So you see a lesson, tremendous lesson in life, that you don't always have to reciprocate to an enemy the way they want you to reciprocate. They want to declare war. I'm not ready to declare war just because you want to declare war. I'm ready. If you want to fight, I'll do what I have to do. But I'll do other things first. Obviously, without putting yourself at risk. The interesting thing here is, on both ends, you have, for example, in Buddhist thinking, Gandhi-like approach, that even if you shoot at me, I will not shoot back. Turn the other cheek. That's not a Jewish approach. You shoot at me, I am going to protect myself. I will not let myself or my children be killed in the name of my own nobility. On the other hand, we're not warriors. We don't begin with war. You shoot, or you're ready to shoot. We'll do something preemptive. We're not going to let you kill us. But we're not going to be the ones that initiate it. We'll protect ourselves. Well, what we'll do is we'll try other attempts until we see there's no choice. This is both collectively, when you talk about nations, a very healthy approach, and personally it's an extremely healthy approach. So if you do indeed have a person like that in your life, what you do is you have to be prudent. You do pray, you try to invoke God's help, you try to invoke something more spiritual. You also be prudent. Sometimes you just have to give them a gift. Maybe you got to bribe them. And I don't mean necessarily out of weakness again. Maybe some people just, that's what they'll respond to. Send them flowers. Even though they're your enemy, who knows? Maybe that will somewhat weaken them. What do you care? As long as you get the job done. I remember, and this is a true story, actually with spouses. A couple I know, very fine couple, very good people. But one of the spouses, the woman, the wife, went through a lot of trauma in her young age. A lot of abandonment issues with her parents. And her husband also traveled a lot for his work. So every time he would travel, she would regress to the point of revisiting the abandonment issues. And she would get really, really emotionally upset. Once he calls me from the road, literally in tears, really upset. She says, my wife called me from home. She says, where are you? She doesn't believe where I am. She thinks I'm just betraying her, cheating on her. And I know that she's recreating her own trauma. It has nothing to do with me. But she said some things that were so hurtful. I want out of this marriage. And he's asking me what to do. And he was really like fuming. He says, enough is enough. I'm a good husband. I've always been loyal. I've always been kind. I always overlook this. I forgive her. But I'm beginning to be resentful, not because I can forgive her, but I have to start treating her like a child, like she's ill. Because the only way I can justify this, because she's not like my equal. And I need a wife that's an equal. I need a wife that understands and acknowledges and is accountable a bit. Here I'm basically accepting this abuse because she's not well from her psychological pain, and I just can't respect her as a wife. If she was my patient, it's one thing. It's more or less what he was saying. I couldn't really argue with him because he was right on one end. But still, I suggested the following. I told him that in Jewish thought, there's a concept called Mavir al Midaisov, which means to ignore your feelings, to overlook your feelings for the benefit of another. Even if your feelings are legitimate. If they're not legitimate, then you don't need someone to tell you to do that. If you're really just angry at someone for no reason, then just get over it, But even if you do have a reason, there's something to be said if you're able to shift and move out of that comfort zone of yours, let's put it this, not the comfort zone, the right word I wanted to use was the natural reaction that you would have, and not react that way. It opens up new doors. It's like a shift. It's a paradigm shift. So I said, my suggestion to you is call the city where your wife is living, where you live, find the best flower shop, and send her the most beautiful bouquet of flowers. He literally, like I could see here on the phone, went crazy. He said, are you nuts? I'm at a point where I want to leave her. I've never been so angry. You're telling me to send her a bouquet of flowers. I said, yeah. The reason I said is because besides the fact that it'll completely be surprised, because she is reacting and she's expecting you to react like the people who abandoned her reacted. Angry, upset, and blaming her. Doing this, you shift something, and you may shift her consciousness. He said, but why should I shift? She's the one that's doing this. I said, because you can see clear. And secondly, it may be good for you too, to go get beyond it. Get beyond it. Because we know that it's not like she doesn't love you, and so on. Anyway, to his credit, he did it because he respected me, I guess. He just did it because I suggested it. Now, I'm not going to say it created a miracle. As a matter of fact, she didn't react right away. It was later. When she came out of it, she understood exactly what happened. Now, she didn't understand at the time what happened, but she saw that he reacted completely in a way that shook her up to the core, because that's not how someone reacts. How do you react when somebody behaves abusively to you? You don't send them a bouquet of flowers. Now, I'm not suggesting in every scenario this should be done. Let me make that clear. I just wanted to give an example that sometimes an appeasement, I don't know, I wouldn't call this a bribe or an appeasement, but sometimes a gesture that's very different than the enemy would expect, or the person who's right now behaving like an enemy would expect, opens up many interesting doors, powerful doors. This, of course, needs to be determined case by case with an objective friend or mentor. I just wanted to mention that. So what do we have here now? So we have here a whole set of new approaches. That's not just here's my enemy, am I passive or aggressive? Not or not. So I've discussed how you determine. You have to first determine whether this is indeed enemy. What do you do when you find out that it's not? What do you do when you find out if it is? And what do you actually do in dealing with the situation? So you see here, it's a really comprehensive strategy. It's not, you're no longer just a victim of somebody else's hatred or somebody else's resentment or someone else's jealousy or someone else's attacks or hostility. You can take control, which is the single most important thing here. Because you cannot control them, but you can control yourself. And you don't want, the last thing you want is to become a reactive force, reacting to things that others are doing. But there's some more things that are interesting in this whole discussion. You actually can learn, there's a verse in the book of Psalms, I became wise from my enemies. My enemies made me wise. Now you can also interpret it, that I'm wise in how to deal with my enemies, but you can learn from your enemies. Because as I mentioned before, any adversity, any adversarial forces in your life, if you're not just reacting to them, there are lessons that you can learn. There are lessons that you can learn, and you can also grow tremendously. Because they bring out, as I said before, they can bring out the worst in you. If you just react, knee-jerk reaction in an impulsive and reflexive way, or they can bring out the best in you because they force you to dig deeper. The expression is that they say about women, you could say about all of us, that we're like tea bags. You don't know how strong you are until you put into hot water. You look at a tea bag, it looks very innocuous. If you wouldn't know what it is, a little patch, a little pack with some tea leaves, right? You put it in hot water, it comes alive. Powerful aroma, it can reinvigorate, it can refresh, it can soothe. Same thing is with us. The best oil is produced when you press an olive. So pressure of all sorts, including someone that may be your enemy, can bring out the best in you. So first of all, for those of us who really, as I said before, analyze ourselves, sometimes we see an enemy, anything that is threatening to us. You have a business, a company, someone else is doing the same thing and they may be doing it better, or you're afraid they'll be doing it better, they become your enemy. But that's basically maybe healthy competition. You ask the best athletes, what made you so great? They said, my adversary, my opponent, because he made me play better. If you didn't have such a good opponent, you wouldn't play that bad. You wouldn't dig so deep. So in a way, competition can make you far greater. Prove yourself. But some people would rather just eliminate the competition because it's easier. Why do I have to worry? Let me kill the competition. So competition is actually, Kina Sofrim Tarba Chochma, is a verse, that is a statement, the Talmud says. The jealousy among scholars increases in wisdom. It's that competition. It's the debates in the Talmud, the debates in any school of thought, argument and counter-argument, question. You ask a question, I give you an answer. You ask a better question, I have to give you a better answer. As long as it's productively directed, constructive, we're not talking about critique that just meant to knock somebody else or just as an excuse for yourself. A true, healthy type of debate is tremendous. Is it more comfortable not to debate? Of course, more comfortable to sit on your laurels and not have to be challenged. But challenges bring the best out of you, if you really think about it. But that's when you have that attitude of recognizing that you are really a healthy, divine soul, and you don't have to be afraid of anything. So that's on the healthy side. What about enemies that are really not healthy enemies? I'm not talking about a healthy competition. They too can teach you much. Because again, for some reason, that person came your way. They're shooting in your direction. So you can become wiser. You learn your own weaknesses because you see where they're attacking. You learn to you become more motivated. You even have that element of victory in your heart. You want to overcome these challenges. So there are many things that they can elicit from you that make you a far greater person. And this again has nothing to do with the other. If you could reconcile with them and if you can find ways to appease and the other things I mentioned, great. If not, you still can come out a greater person. And that's what happened to Jacob, and that's what happened to all those that had their wars and enemies. They became greater people. Even the Jews in Egypt, it says, even though they were oppressed, they were in slavery. They weren't equal. They were enslaved by the Egyptians. It says, Kashiyana, as they were oppressed, in direct proportion to that, they proliferated. They thrived and they grew. Now, we're not looking for oppression. We're not looking for enemies. But we're saying if it's coming your way, it forces you to become greater. Whether we like it or not, and it's not something pleasant to say, but the Israeli military is one of the most powerful in the world because it had to unfortunately fight wars. Other countries with far greater armies and far greater money don't have that experience. Now, we shouldn't need that experience and we shouldn't want it and we shouldn't, well, that's what happens. You develop greater tools. And frankly, if you're familiar, war is basically the father of most innovation. Many of the advancements in the economy, in commodities that we have, came as a result of war. Just to give an example, before World War I, there was no such thing as a belt for pants. Everyone wore suspenders. But they were looking for a new way because they had to dress the military for World War I in mass. They were looking for a way where you don't have to give them suspenders and pants, so they figured out to make a belt within the pants. So a belt was invented in order to make a better war machine. And the same thing with many technologies, even the internet. How do you like that? The internet was born during World War II as an intra-secret network of communication for the military, U.S. military. And no one knew about it until the late 60s and the early 70s when the United States government finally said, let's make it available first for EDU, for universities, networking and interacting. And now look what it is today. There's no one that could have developed it, all the trial and error and all the mistakes, that the trillions of dollars probably necessary to correct, to get troubleshoot and all that over the years, except the government, because no company would have such monies. So it's amazing if you think about it. So there you have, enemies have made us wiser, have made us greater. Did we ask for it? No, we would have all preferred no World War I, no World War II. But once you're already faced with it, might as well grow through it. But this again brings you to that alei vecha, that we are above our enemies, because we're not looking to, war does not define us. We deal with it. It's last resort, and we grow through it. That's another tremendous lesson. And also individually, that's what can happen. I have my own life. Thank God I have not had to have many wars. Everyone has their little battles. And some of them can end up demoralizing you, weakening you, causing you to feel very vulnerable and not want to take any more initiatives. I found the challenges that I've had, that they've actually made me grow, made my organization grow, made many things in my life grow, because I was not defined by those experiences. They happened, but they did not define me. You cannot allow the war to define you. And when I say war, I don't mean necessarily even physical war. I mean even on a psychological or emotional level. So with that, we address the fact of how to rise above and to recognize that even battles can make you grow on every particular level. You have situations, for example, sibling rivalry. Sibling rivalry, if parents are not healthy, can be a very destructive element, because it can undermine the security that children should have at home. But when it's in a healthy environment, there's nothing wrong with it. On the contrary. It's like you find, even in the animal world, you find little cubs what's the word I want? Wrestling with each other. And it's not because they're fighting. It's a way of honing their tools, honing their skills, preparing them for the times they will need to deal with challenges in life. And you'll see, interestingly, the more loving, the more nurturing a home, the more it prepares you for the situations that are not nurturing. Unfortunately, a non-nurturing home, although obviously when there's a battle and there's a war in the home itself, whether between parents or family unit in different ways, that undermines our ability to go out and really fight the wars that we would have to fight in life. So we've addressed several different angles. I was just looking here at some of the other points I wanted to talk about. So the true meaning of an enemy, yes, we covered. How to deal with an enemy in a healthy, proactive way versus reactively. How to avoid making enemies in the first place. We're going to discuss that in a minute. How to take the high road, not allowing yourself to be poisoned by your enemies. How to grow and learn from your enemies, becoming a greater person in the process. Skills to navigate the terrains of adversity, yes. And various methods, some of them surprising, to deal with enemies. Okay, I just wanted to make sure that I delivered on what I promised here. Yeah. So I want to talk now about avoiding enemies in the first place. In psychological circles, we know there's a very interesting phenomenon. Even though it sounds counterintuitive, but the reality is people who grew up in a war zone in their homes, where there were conflicts, where there were battles, where there was a constant animosity, whether between husband and wife, father and mother, between parents and children, between the different children. People growing up in such an environment has unfortunately consequences. And one of them is that you become used to a adversarial environment, to the point where if it doesn't exist, you feel something's wrong. Often people growing up in such homes will create chaos and conflict to thrive, because they think that's the way things should be. It sounds odd, because who wants to do that? But I've seen this time and again, to the point where you realize what's going on. That people growing up in a chaotic environment, conflicting environment, feel the need to create conflict. They don't do it consciously, but they upset the barrel. They are invested almost in creating confrontation. And they feel that's like because that for them is natural. And when things are very harmonious and calm, to them it's just a short-term reality. It's like the quiet before the storm. And the key, of course, is to train and educate people like that you have it wrong. It's the other way around. The natural state is to have calm. And chaos and crisis is the aberration, as I mentioned before. But that's a reality in some people's lives. And therefore, when they see someone confront them, in a way, they thrive on that. And they go right for it. Oh, confronting me? Great. I have the tools. I've learned how to survive with confrontation. Let's go to battle. So anyone in that type of situation is going to naturally always gravitate to battles. And therefore will make enemies and actually invite some almost enemies. Sometimes will even do things to provoke people. I mean, I can't tell you how many scenarios where I've seen a spouse actually constantly provoking, wanting a battle. And the other spouse doesn't want to fight. And that disturbs the spouse. Now, of course, a lot of this is unconscious or subconscious, but it happens. So the first thing to know, first thing to analyze is, if you're that type of person, obviously you're not just going to rise above the situation. You want enemies in a way. No one's going to say, hey, I need an enemy in my life, obviously. But in a certain subconscious way, you are almost inviting it. And you create situations where there is a challenge and hostility. I remember on a Friday, it was a Friday, I was flying somewhere, maybe to Miami, I don't remember where, Montreal. And behind me there was a woman who was, very, very, you could see very bitter and angry, arguing with everybody, saying that everybody was getting in front of her. And then she suddenly decided to confront me too, that I also got in front of her. I mean, I was there long before her, I didn't even see her. She decided. And I saw it was a person that has a lot of issues. You could see it on her face. And I even saw she was Jewish, actually, because she even said to me somewhere some type of nasty remark like, you're a rabbi. How could you behave like that? One of those things. Now, if I was a less secure person and a little less healthy, I would have been offended. I saw some of the matters. I said, go ahead in front of me. No problem. It wasn't even an issue for me. because what do I care? She wants to go in front. So she didn't want to go. She didn't go. She says, no, you're a nasty person. She was dwelling on it. I said, go ahead. I completely yielded, so to speak. And the more I yielded, the more angry she got. It was hilarious to me. She says, no, I want you to apologize. It was complete insanity. So I said, can you tell me what I should apologize for? I was going to apologize even, but then, I wanted to at least leave some seed of sanity here. I'm not going to go there. She said, yeah, for behaving the way you behaved. I said, how did I behave? She says, you gave me that look. I don't want to, there's no lashon hara. I'm not saying who it was. I don't even know who it was, frankly. So I said, I gave you a look. She said, now you're laughing at me? I said, no, I'm laughing at myself because I didn't remember. I had to remember giving you this look. I still laugh till now. Who knows how long ago? I think it was 2 years ago. I just remember it was just, I study people all the time, and I study social, the human condition. And I wish I could have said something nice. I said, it was Friday. I said, I wouldn't wish you a good Shabbos. I think I told her. She says, who are you to tell me good Shabbos? Whatever I said wouldn't work. It made no difference. I think I did say to her, I said, you should go to meaningfullife.com. There's an article there about how to interact. I don't know if she listened. She didn't listen. I might as well use it for a plug. Why not? Maybe we could help her. But I honestly didn't see her as a bad person. I just said she must be hurt in some way. But I saw that no matter what you say, she was creating hostility where there was no hostility even. It was like the opposite extreme. There was no enemy. I was not her enemy. Nobody else was. And even if you try to be friendly to her, she didn't even like that either. A lot of anger, a lot of bitterness. I mean, it must be from the home. I'm not going to overanalyze someone I don't really know. Just point out, you see this. You see it in road rage. People become enemies, road rage. And someone cuts you off, and then you're going to war. I have to get back at them. And some people will drive miles to cut back that person off. I even heard a story. Someone followed someone off an exit, and they stopped at a bank, and they went out and punched them 10 miles down the road because they cut them off, because they thought they cut them off intentionally back there. These are unfortunately people who need help and need work and need love. This doesn't mean we tolerate whatever they do, but it means that it's very difficult when you're that type of person. I'm giving more extreme examples, but there are more subtle ones. How could a person like that not have enemies? You'll create them even if they don't exist. And then you say, everybody hates me. Everybody's hostile. But you don't understand, your hostility is making everybody hostile, because who wants to be around somebody like that? You come to a party and someone's like that, who wants to be near them? They're toxic. Now again, I'm not judging them. I'm not even criticizing them. I'm just saying, so what do? We have to get ourselves out of that state of mind if we have that state of mind. You want to avoid enemies, you yourself can't be a hostile person. You have to be a loving, kind person. That's why even in the worst circumstances, you don't begin by going to war. You begin with a prayer, you begin with appeasement, you find ways, you try to be flexible, you try. Doesn't work, it doesn't work, as I mentioned. But you're not going to allow compromise your own, let's call it your purity and your sanctity because someone else has issues. That's how you avoid enemies in the first place. So you like it's a chess game. You're 10 steps ahead. You don't allow it to affect you. You don't allow somebody's hostility to affect you, so you transcend it all. Now, if there's a situation, like I said, you do everything and you still have, there are situations. Look at the fact there were beautiful Jews, 6 million Jews, who did not respond with hostility, and yet they were killed and cremated and gassed and tortured in the most inhumane way. Clearly, we knew who the enemy was. And no matter what the Jews would have done, it wouldn't have made a difference. So that's something you can't control. And I'm obviously not discussing that. But in all other circumstances, in more personal circumstances, you could avoid many of the so-called battles and wars by just simply keeping your composure and your dignity and not allowing yourself to be affected as I spoke about earlier. And yes, we could achieve a state where we can transcend and be above that picture. I wanted to address one more thing that I also spoke about: friends. The opposite of enemy would seem to be a friend. Yeah, what you could say is correct. Very often when we get caught up in negative energy, we also forget about our positive stuff. You see this all the time. People talk about their grievances and their anger and their fears, and you say to them, all their concerns, you say, do you have any blessings in your life? Yeah, but then they say, yeah, but. What do you mean, but? Why don't the blessings be the prominent part of your life, and the negatives are the secondary part? That to me is a sign where a person's priority is in the wrong place. If you do indeed see yourself as a divine soul, and hostility and enemies is an aberration, that's one way to look at things. But if you see yourself as a hostile natural state, and friends are the aberration, obviously you're going to be focusing on the negative. So it's critical to say, one second, where's the positive energy in my life? Where are my friends? Why am I only talking about those that are hurting me? What about those that support me, that love me? And then you may find that your list of enemies is much bigger than your list of friends. But that's your choice. That's not the case. It's because you're focusing so much, expending so much energy there in fighting the negative that you forgot to invest a little time in accentuating the positive. That would be like living in a home where, let's say, there's a lot of dust, right? A lot of germs. And you're busy basically keep on getting disinfectants and germ neutralizers. I don't know what they're called. You constantly find the germs. Why don't you start bringing in maybe a little fresh air, or bringing some beauty into the home? Instead of constantly fighting the toxins, bring some positive. If you do have to disinfect, fine. But that shouldn't be the focus. The focus should bring positive energy, bring friendship in your life, bring love into your life. Bring that energy into your life, and you'll have less time and less focus and less headspace for dealing with the negative. And it seems like a very practical advice, but I find it so difficult to convince people to think that way. Because they say, well, first I got to get rid of my enemies, then I'll start building friends. Doesn't make sense. That's not really correct. The real truth is we're in a habit. Our mind and our emotions are now been conditioned and programmed to just be in a negative state, or primarily so. So anything positive is like, I don't have the time for it. It became your routine. And breaking that routine is not that easy. So you have to do it step by step. I remember someone coming to this class for many years. They still pop in once in a while. They don't live here anymore in New York. And she told me that, I don't always get everything you say in the class, but it is so refreshing and so healing for me, because I grew up in such negative energy in my life. I come here, I just feel, you talk about the dignity of the soul, you talk about positive things, and even if I don't always understand it, it's an environment that feels vibrant and healthy. And I found that to be a very moving compliment, because it wasn't even what I said, it was just the attitude. And it's true. If you open yourself to an environment, if you've been breathing toxins all your life, and suddenly you go into a room that's healthy, you know what you're going to do? You're going to start coughing. Hey, you'll say, hey, this is not right. Well, that's not right because you've been breathing toxins your whole life, so, try to breathe. Have you tried to breathe all the way down? Take a full breath all the way to as much deep as you can go. You'll usually cough. You know why? Because the bottom of the lungs at this stage in our lives is no longer completely clear. It has toxins. Newborn children, you look at their chest, it heaves up and down. They're using 100% of their lungs. We don't use 100% of our lungs. So we cough. Why do we cough? Not because we're healthy, because we're unhealthy. So when you suddenly breathe something fresh, you got to acclimate yourself. You got to train yourself. That's why you can't just do it so easily. So don't become trapped by your routines. Don't become trapped by don't become a victim of your own circumstances. Realize that we may have developed unhealthy attitudes and we need to bring fresh air. Step by step. Maybe a new friend once a month. Is that manageable? Once every 2 months? Once a year? Once a century? No. Let's not go that far. Once a period of time. A new friend doesn't mean completely new friend. Meeting someone new, trying out a new class, reading a new book. Anything that's that's fresh. Anything that's not part of your old pattern or routine, you'll be surprised. These little shifts make tremendous difference because it's a shift. It's a little shift and the whole river can turn a different way. Not overnight. It happens slowly, but it's a consciousness shift. It's a shift in perspective. And that is a very practical way of somewhat reversing some of our old patterns. So, my friends, I said my friends, I believe, I have no enemies in this world, I think. I think some people may think I'm their enemy, but I don't, I mean, I will fight to protect my family and my people and my nation and all that, but not because I think them, because they decide we're their enemies. And I feel free when you say that. I really think, do I carry any resentment to anybody? Not really. And I wish that upon all of you. And it's something that is in our choice. Again, you can't control what others' interests are, but you can control completely what's in your mind and your heart and how you react to things. So I hope I did some justice to this very fundamental topic. And I think if we apply these principles personally and familially, meaning our family structure, and community, and we'll go all the way to the state, to the nation, to the globe, we could have actually a changed world. Because at the end of the day, 7 billion people on this earth is 7 billion individuals like us. And it's critical to realize, I go back to what I said at the beginning, that we have the enemy within. The enemy within is our own fears, our own insecurities, our own patterns. And that has a big impact of how we look at others. But when you're ready to look at yourself a little objectively and look at your blind spots and have someone help and identify these things, they can tremendously change, radically change the way we look at life. And maybe even open up a receptivity to people being friends of ours. Because nobody wants to be friends with someone who is hostile, who has hostile energy. When you free yourself a little, suddenly people who in the past would not want to be around you may want to be around you. I know it's a harsh statement to say, but sometimes negative energy does not repels. And often quality people want to be around somebody that they feel empowered by. They don't want to be around people who depress them. And that's in our control. But you have to be ready to speak to someone, to be open, and be ready to maybe accept some constructive critique, or at least analysis, and a person who's sensitive and loving and kind, that's not judgmental, obviously. And with that, we can come to a time, as we are now in the period moving from the saddest time of the calendar to great times. Because the 15th of Av, so 6 days after the 9th of Av, is considered the full moon. The Talmud compares it and says there were no greater holidays than the 15th of Av and Yom Kippur, because this is like the healing of the violation of dignity, of hostility, of all forms of dissonance that Tisha B'Av brings on. The number 9, which is like the 10 spheres minus Malchus minus dignity, the 10 faculties without dignity, and then there's the restoration of it on the 15th of Av, which is like Yom Kippur as well. After the building of the golden calf, the tshuva that was achieved, the atonement, when Moses came with the second tablets, the atonement that comes after the break. So it's one thing being a healthy person, another is going through difficulties, having hostilities in your life, having enemies, and growing through it, and coming to a place of healing. That healing is greater than the initial health without having all these challenges. So challenges can bring something out of us that we do not have when we don't have challenges. That's ultimately the positive news that exists even with the enemies around us, as I mentioned. So may we all grow that way and travel as we travel now. The Jewish calendar is a perfect model of life's cycles, the ups and the downs, the twists and the turns, the ebbs and what's the opposite of ebbs? Yeah, the peaks and the valleys, the waning and the waxing of the moon. This is all part of a cycle. And understanding it as such, therefore, even negative energy becomes a catalyst, a springboard for the positive. So everyone have a very positive week, a very healing week, a very friendly and growthful one, even when we're dealing with the adversarial forces around us. So until next Wednesday, I'll be here. Everyone should have a very blessed and pleasant week. Thank you very much. Did you get the email?
No, didn't look at it, but you probably were away. So.
It was in Israel.
Rabbi, should I get the plug?